Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I remember being in Hamburg, Germany. I believe it was last year, maybe the year before, I think, and very different. It was a different situation. Most people were in the room, and I think we were streaming live as well. But in this brave new world that we have, we're all on Zoom. But at least we're here together, and it's a great thing to have so many people from so many different countries all together to discuss this really important topic. Well, thank you for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, Investigating the Radical Right, a Global Perspective. The world's witnessing an upsurge in the radical right and ultranationalist political movements. This has been notable in the US for several years, but these groups really span the globe, ranging from white supremacists and neo-fascist gangs to ethnic nationalists and religious fundamentalists, to so-called fascist drinking clubs and fight clubs. As you'll learn from our panelists, international ties among these groups are growing digitally, ideologically, financially, but their networks are poorly understood, and investigative journalism in this area has really lagged behind. I'm Will Carless, and I cover extremism and emerging issues nationwide for USA Today, but I've been on the extremism and hate beat since 2017, where I was previously at Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting up until November last year. So before we get started with the panelists, I've been asked to share a few tips for covering extremism and extremists. And I'm going to keep these fairly simple, hopefully, and fairly wide-ranging given the diversity of the viewers of this webinar. The first thing I want to say is a lot of this work hinges on definitions. And I would say be very careful when relying even on established sources to define the groups and individuals you're tracking and you're interested in. A lot of the information out there on these people is simply wrong. The only way you can truly understand extremist groups is by knowing them well enough to create your own definition of what they stand for and how far they will go to accomplish their goals. That means you need to be the expert. Don't think that there is some monolithic organization out there that understands these groups better than you do. You and your fellow journalists are probably on the cutting edge, and really that should be your job to understand this, to understand this world and these groups and these individuals better than anybody else. Secondly, I'd say don't be scared off by the haters. And I don't just mean from one side or the other. I primarily cover the far right, but I can honestly say that most of the hate and abuse that I get is actually from the other side, from the far left. I get harangued on Twitter for interviewing the extremists that I'm writing stories about. And I've been decried for suggesting that even terrorists are human beings and deserve their say. I strongly believe that our job as journalists is to listen and to accurately and fairly pass on what we learn to our audiences. And our ability to do that honestly becomes cramped the moment we give in to any one political pressure group that seeks to ridicule or minimize us. And believe me, if you cover extremism in any way, shape, or form, that's going to happen to you. You're going to get people pressuring you and hassling you and trying to direct your coverage. And please be as strong as you can in maintaining steadfast and being fair. And the last tip is that my former colleagues now at Reveal put together a tip sheet for staying safe online as a reporter covering extremism. And that tip sheet will be emailed out to everyone. And I believe it's also going to be shared in the chat here on the Zoom. With the tips over, a very quick note about my work. Since 2017, I've watched as extremist movements in the US have morphed and reinvented themselves. I've seen hucksters like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos rise and then fall. And I've watched as thousands of people invaded the US Capitol on January the 6th, including groups that anybody on the extremist beat had been warning about for years. And now I'm growing increasingly interested in these international connections between those seemingly disparate groups. And as such, I'm delighted that we've been joined by 3 other journalists with extensive experience in investigating far-right groups and extremist individuals across the globe. So let me just introduce them. Michael Colborne is a journalist who's written extensively about the radical right. His current work focuses on the far right in Central and Eastern Europe with a special interest in transnational radical right extremism. Michael's a contributing team member at investigative journalism site Bellingcat, which if you haven't checked out, you need to. The number of times I'm looking for a definitive story on something that I'm covering and I end up at a Bellingcat story is quite remarkable. They're a small organization, but they do extremely good work. Vinod K is the executive editor of the independent watchdog media outlet, The Caravan, India's only narrative journalism magazine. The magazine has covered in depth the rise of the RSS, India's most powerful right-wing Hindu nationalist organization. Previously, he was the founding editor of the Malayalam language Free Press. And I'd warrant that Vinod's work probably gets more reads and more eyes on it than the rest of us put together. And lastly, GIJN Lytvynenko is a senior reporter at BuzzFeed News, where she investigates online disinformation. Her work focuses on analyzing the spread of fake news and the rise of conspiracy theories and global extremism through online platforms using digital tools. I'm a fanboy. She does really incredible work, and you should really pay attention to it. So lastly, before we start, a little bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network, for those of you not familiar with it. GIJN is the largest global network of non-profit investigative journalism organizations with 203 member organizations in 80 countries. But it works with journalists everywhere, in non-profits, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. It has an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, so please check them out at GIJN.org. And we also want to hear from you in the audience. Please send written questions and messages in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can start by asking questions from now and in any language, as your questions will be translated. When the speakers are finished, GIJN colleague Hannah Coogans will join us on screen to moderate those questions. And lastly, please note we'll be recording this session for posting later on YouTube. So let's get started. And I'm going to turn now to Michael Colborne, who I just introduced. He's joining us from Canada. So go ahead, please, Michael.
Well, thanks, Will, and thanks to the GIJN for inviting me here, and for my fellow panelists for tolerating my presence. So what I'm going to briefly talk about today is my work primarily with Bellingcat and looking at using open source information and publicly available information to try and understand what far right or what radical right individuals and groups are up to. So as Will mentioned in the introduction, the primary focus of my work is on Central and Eastern Europe. It's what I've focused a lot on Ukraine, as will be clear in one of my examples, but I also focus on a number of other countries, and I've written about the far right in Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and places like that. So, and also our work with Bellingcat going forward, we are going to be doing much more work on the Central and Eastern European far right. So for those who like our work or don't like our work, regardless, you're going to have to see more of us and hear more about us from countries we may not have covered in as much detail before, so stay tuned. So what I'm going to walk through are very briefly, two examples of how I've used, with my work with Bellingcat particularly, how I've used open source information to understand what far right individuals and groups are up to. And my first example is looking at an individual. And I don't often write about especially devote specific articles to individuals on the far right, because I wonder and worry sometimes if focusing too much on an individual helps give them a platform. I worry sometimes that maybe if we focus too much on an individual, it gives them more of a profile and it's something that they can benefit from. But nonetheless, sometimes there's, I think, a reason to to focus on specific individuals. And so I'll just walk through a process of how I started writing about an American white supremacist, far-right extremist, Robert Rundo. I won't give too much background on him, but he essentially is one of the co-founders of the violent Rise Above movement. And he was on trial for violence at a rally in California in 2017. That case was thrown out. It's being appealed. And in the wake of that, he went to Europe last year. And I was covering the way that I kind of came across Robert Rundo to write about specifically. It was really just more of a coincidence. I was covering last year at this time, I was covering two far-right events, one in Budapest, Hungary, and the other in Sofia, Bulgaria. And Robert Rundo and somebody else from the Rise Above movement, or one of his colleagues, they attended both of those events. And it was clear that from everybody who was keeping an eye on the far right, that he was, well, spending time in Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe. So after that, I kind of kept a bit of a note or an eye every time something about him would come up. And in March of last year, I think March or April of last year in 2020, he posted a video that was clearly identifiable as being from Belgrade, Serbia. And didn't think much of it at the time, because he's been around several of these countries. These far-right movements in these countries are interconnected. Again, didn't think much of it. But as the summer went on, I noticed on his Telegram channel, and other journalists covering the far right noticed as well, that although it was kind of hard to figure out exactly where he was, it was pretty clear that he was not in the United States, and that he was clearly somewhere in Europe. And likely from some of the backgrounds that were in the videos, it was very broadly speaking, somewhere in Eastern Europe. Now, that's not necessarily very helpful. I would see some of these things. I was kind of keeping an eye on him, but not really focusing too much, almost just more on the side as I was looking into other things in more detail. But then in about September of last year, I noticed he posted a video and photos in the background. It was clear that it was some sort of like lake resort location with a lot of clearly identifiable or very unique rock geographic formations in the background. And so out of curiosity in September, I asked some of my Bellingcat colleagues, who are far better at geolocating than I am. I asked some of them, hey, can you guys, any chance you guys could figure out where this video and photo was taken? And within about 45 minutes, they geolocated it to a location in Serbia. So it became clear that even by September, October, that it was likely that he was in Serbia. And again, at that point, I didn't even necessarily think an entire article about him was really necessary. But then as I kept following him, I saw another photo that, and other things that made it clear that he was in Serbia. Not only that he was in Serbia, but that he was in Belgrade. And then I decided, okay, I really better look at this in more detail. The primary reason being that I myself happened to be in Belgrade at the time. And I hadn't planned on staying that long. I was going to be there for a few weeks looking at other projects, but I decided to look into it in a bit more detail. I just started taking notes, trying to, doing some image search on some of the things that I'd found. And I was collecting information, and he posted one thing that he did was he posted a photo at a location that I actually recognized, because I used to have an apartment by there. That was a bit strange. So I was getting more and more likely that, okay, this individual is in Belgrade. Okay, what is he doing? And then this, I mean, it still makes me laugh at how I didn't think about doing this before, is that Robert Rundo, he has like a lot of these figures on the far right, he has a far right fashion brand. I'm not going to bother naming it right now, but I decided, I was just sitting there gathering some information, and I decided I should just Google the name of his fashion brand and see what comes up. not any Boolean search like Jane is going to talk about, but just quite a simple plugging it in. I think it was even on my phone. And I got a hit for a company registered in Serbia under that name. And then I looked into the Serbian company registry and found that he had registered a company in his name in Serbia in July 2020. And the reason why that immediately changed the game for me is that that is what one would do. It's an easy way to get temporary residency in Serbia, is to found a company or become an entrepreneur. So at that point, that's when I really decided, okay, this individual who is newsworthy in some ways, but not so much in others. He doesn't necessarily have a huge profile, as huge a profile on the international far right as some people think, but it became very clear that there was a reason that he was in Serbia. And then I decided to publish the article with Bellingcat, reached out to people who were associated with him for comment, reached out to him for comment, didn't get much, and then published that article. And after publishing that article, it got a lot of media attention in Serbia. It was essentially, why is this American far-right extremist camped out in our capital city and in our country? And kind of after that, he went a bit more underground. And then about 2 weeks ago, there's a report that Serbian authorities had actually kicked him out of the country. This still hasn't been confirmed yet. And I certainly can't say it was a direct result of my reporting with Bellingcat, but his profile in Serbia only increased because Bellingcat wrote about them. So long story short with that is, sometimes it may not seem when you first look into an individual that they're worth writing about on their own, or sometimes you might question whether they're worth a longer profile or given that much attention. But if you can put it in the context of what an individual is doing in the broader context of the international far right, in other words, in this case, like an individual clearly trying to build some kind of new base or network in a different country, that I think in my mind, it met my personal criteria for writing about an individual. So quickly moving on from that, one of the far-right groups or movements that I've written a lot about is Ukraine's Azov movement. I'm actually writing a book this year on the Azov movement, and a lot of, a lot of the research, a lot of the information for that book has come out of open source research and just using publicly available information. And there certainly is a lot out there. Now, without getting into too much detail, because I think the Azov movement could have maybe 1 or 2 seminars on its own just to explain it, it's essentially a kind of a heterogeneous far-right social movement that was born out of the Azov regiment in Ukraine, which was formed in 2014 to fight against Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine. So Azov it grew from this sort of far-right militia that was fighting in the war to a much broader social movement, has everything like a political party, a social center, 2 separate little publishing houses, a book club, youth organizations, into a broader social movement that it's hard to estimate figures or adherents, but most estimates are somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people that are affiliated with the movement. And the Azov movement, obviously, like a lot of far-right movements, or if not all far-right movements, has a very strong social media presence, particularly on Telegram. So what I would stress from really about the last 2 years of really extensively using open sources to understand this particular far-right movement, there's just some lessons that I would pass on, and they're lessons that I've used researching all sorts of other far-right groups, big and small, new and old, and everything in between. One of them is to not to get too far ahead of yourself when you discover or relationships or connections between different channels or individuals or groups or subgroups. The starting point for me to understand any far-right movement is to look at not just the official, quote unquote, official output of their social media channels on Telegram, on Instagram, on Facebook, if they have it, on Twitter, if they have it, but also to get a sense of what some of the, as best as you can, what individual rank and file members of these movements think. That means, you know, seeing on Instagram who some of their followers are, looking at their profiles, gauging from that, getting into Telegram chats. As much as I like to pretend that I'm some mega sleuth, a lot of these Telegram chats of far-right movements are public and you don't even have to join them. So if you just kind of, well, sit on the outside and troll some of these chats, you can get a sense of at least what some members of a movement's rank and file, or I guess non-official parts of a movement, you can get quite a good sense of what some of those people think. And from there, I would stress that it's important to try to differentiate or understand in what context a far-right group or an individual is posting in. Is this, if you see a post with a bunch of pictures of them promoting an event they protested, is this for the purposes of propaganda and recruitment? In other words, did what they say happened really happen, or is this just to try to look good? That, of course, that's not always easy. It requires understanding it in context. But I think what I've really found useful, especially when you look at monitoring or looking at groups or movements over time using open source, is understanding how things may have changed. And that's really, I think, key with a movement like the Azov movement, where you can write about something related to it, an individual, a sub-movement, trends within the movement. You can write about it, and then 3 months later, it's already out of date because something has changed. That little subgroup doesn't exist anymore, or doesn't seem to be posting as much. So what's really useful for me with what I would stress with using open source information to understand a far-right group is to understand what subgroups, formally or informally affiliated with the far-right movement, have they changed? Have some of these subgroups disappeared or stopped posting or posted entirely different things? Have new ones all of a sudden sprouted up? If they're new ones, who seems to be behind them? How are their narratives new or different from narratives that you might have seen on these channels before? And that's another key thing, is of course to understand what narratives are being talked about on far-right, on these far-right channels, on these sources. And of course, it'll even differentiate within movements. It's important to understand as well what sorts of alliances or relationships might have changed over time with the far-right group. Like it can become pretty clear looking at open source information what far-right groups have at least some relationship across borders. But you can assess, okay, are they not posting or not talking about this friend abroad anymore? Do they seem to be talking about new groups, or do they seem to have formed new relationships? Or are people just posting much more or much less content than they were before? And also, I think something that's key is to try to understand what personalities or personal profiles of individuals might rise or fall within a movement. Like that's something I think you can clearly see with a movement like the Azov movement, where individuals almost seem to fall out of favor with the leadership, and all of a sudden their stuff isn't posted anymore. Or there are individuals who, it seems clear, like individuals, for example, within the last year have started up Telegram channels that all of a sudden clearly became popular and posted by leadership. And it's how you can use open source information. And the way that I liken it, I mean, this is a cliche, but it's absolutely true, is to use open source information as if you're putting together a puzzle. And as you start to collect more information, you can start to have, you can start to see what's probably forming there. You get more information, you can really draw a better picture. But then sometimes, you know, to carry this metaphor to death, sometimes the table gets jarred and then pieces fly all over, and then you've got to put new ones in. And sometimes when you're putting together a puzzle, you try to put things together and it doesn't work, and then sometimes it does. It's always important when you think you've drawn a picture of what a far-right movement looks like based on open source information. It's always important to step back. It's always important to in my opinion, to go beyond open source information to develop sources and to ask people who are knowledgeable about the far right as well, colleagues of yours, other researchers, or people who are also familiar with the country or familiar with the political context that you might not be aware of. That also helps to put a lot of these pieces together. And I think at this point, that is all that I have, Will.
Thank you, Michael. That kind of goes back to the point that I made at the start about, you know, doing your own definition making, right? I mean, a lot of these groups, you know, they're new, you're playing a game of whack-a-mole to a certain extent, where you're trying to understand what's the latest kind of version of these groups, right?
And you're also, it's also interesting with larger far-right movements like the Azov movement, and this would apply to movements that I don't cover in particular detail. I'm thinking of, for example, the Casa Pound movement in Italy. Larger far-right movements, it becomes clear that there are unofficial, unaffiliated little subgroups that are part of the movement or under the umbrella of the movement, but they're different enough that when it comes down to it, there's almost a plausible deniability where you can say, oh, those hardcore literal Hitler worshipping neo-Nazis aren't part of our movement, when it's pretty clear that the individuals themselves who are behind that, they're part of the same movement. So it's a matter of deliberate playing games with language and positioning. So
right, and they're all feeding off each other. Yeah. Well, thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it. I'm going to move on to Vinod. Vinod, I'll admit I wasn't very familiar with your work prior to getting involved in this panel, but you're doing some really fascinating stuff there in India. And thanks for joining us also so late in the evening. So without any further ado, let me pass over to Vinod Jose.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, GIJN, for having me. Since I think mostly the brief is also to sort of speak through tip sheets and so forth, especially since we have, I think, as audience investigative journalists. So let me just share a screen here and speak on the sites. So, all right, I mean, see, the Indian story for journalists, even for journalists who are in India and elsewhere, is interestingly now the far right who has come to power through the electoral route is not just the result of one leader or one party. It's a movement which has been around for 96 years. So of course, certainly there are things that, when we look for stories and when we start working through that, I think the primary thing that I would like to put on the radar for journalists would be, don't ignore the deep roots that they have. We must study their history and the current spread, because the history gives us a sense of the genesis of the organization, the founders, where do they get their oxygen from, and what their long-term goals are. That's also very important, because most of them might package and present themselves as political parties, but they actually have civilizational goals. And now it's very difficult for us to understand if we just approach it as another political party beat, because you might just go to them thinking that that's what you hear from them publicly, what they say is who they are, but often that's far from the truth. For example, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, which is the parent organization, and some people describe it as, for people to understand easily, it's like a holding company of many smaller companies affiliated to it. Last time, I think we counted there are some 65 or so organizations with specific character to each of it, something which would work with the lawyers, something for the students, women, indigenous people. So different sections they try to sort of work. So the spread is huge. The history is very interesting too for an organization like this, because you see there is the time that they came up, let's say the 1930s and 1940s, they were admiring Mussolini and Hitler. And so much so, some of their patrons had direct contact with, let's say, somebody like Mussolini. They traveled, they met, they made the organization, the cadre of the organization after Balilla and other fascist organization in Italy. Some of them have very openly, the founding fathers have openly said that what Hitler was doing in Germany is what these organizations should be doing in India. But those years, the freedom the years when we got freedom and the first elections, for example, in India, that was a tiny minority. Their vote share was not more than 4 or 5%. But of course, over the years, they have become huge. So it's important for us to know the history of some of these organizations, who they are, what their influences have been, and so forth. And also we should know the founders as people, like their food taste, their opinion on language, their opinion on different cultures, their opinion on gender, and many of this I think will also help, because those values, whether have people moved on from there, have the new generation leaders, have they corrected their positions, have they apologized for some shameful positions their founders had. So it's sometimes sort of we'll be able to see why and how does somebody hold an opinion or somebody act in a certain way in 2021. And you see that there is an ideological puritanism that often they refer to and they go back to, and certainly they show. Yes, of course, the web of organization, sometimes it's too many and too big, and even for us to sort of map it. But it's a necessary exercise for us to do that. There could be hundreds of NGOs associated. I mean, of course, the cadre will be like in a country like India would come to several millions, if you put all the organizations together. And the other aspect is also, most of these organizations are global. It's not just local and within the country. You see, I mean, Caravan had done a cover story many years ago on the connection of the far right in Europe and the RSS, and how they were working together, and how some of the leaders were working together and meeting each other, and so forth. In the context of US election, we know that the RSS men had fundraised for Tulsi Gabbard and wanted her as the candidate there, and so forth. So in a nutshell, I think there is an exercise, an academic exercise, it might sound, where we sort of need to follow the history, and then we need to have an assessment of the web and the spread of it. Second is, of course, and then we need to watch some very closely to see signs of law breaking, and this, I think, if a necessary next step, because we now have the context and the history. Now we sort of watch them closely. One obvious thing, as we see all over in the world for far right, which is very common, is that it is built on hatred. That there is a hatred, there is an enemy which is very deeply explained who the enemy is, and they tell the story in a way that can get people on the fence on their side. They work on the emotions. And some of this hatred would get reflected through terror activities, like it could be a bomb attack, it could be targeted killings, it could be riots. So often keep a watch on how they decide to demonstrate their hatred. Then the sort of more kosher, white-collar tasks in many sense for them is disinformation campaigns. And we see this, we have seen a huge rise in the disinformation campaign in the last 5-6 years. Of course, social media has been around for a while, but in the first few years, probably not, or even if it was, maybe did not get that much attention. But in the last 5-6 years, I think journalists all over the world and even public opinion realize that how disinformation campaign is an organized work of people. The other is certainly we need to know, especially in a country like India, where you see things, this organization has been around for so long. There are people who have grown and groomed within the organization who might end up in certain high-profile professions like, media, judiciary, bureaucracy, film world. And you see the career advancement in some sense. The more the party and the ideologies in power, the more obvious they become, their affiliations become, that's certainly something to sort of keep an eye on. The people's movement, who is where and who is going from where to where, and what projects, who is funding, who is affiliated, how do they come together, what do they form, the networks, and so forth. And I think by this exercise, by around this stage, I think it's certainly very clear that they hate democracy as a political system, and they're very hostile to diversity and consensus and conversations where people could disagree, but then also have an opinion. And we also see that most of them are not just temporary political goals, and they are larger civilizational goals. They want to build a certain kind of country. They want to have geographical unity of a certain nature. And all that, I think, becomes very evident when we study them closely. They certainly oppose rule of law in many instances. They have certain conservative views on women's rights. Plurality of thought is something that they disagree. Freedom of press, certainly they really don't like investigative journalists as a breed. So there are some hostilities and issues that you will see when you start developing relationships with them as sources and so forth. So the third stage, I think, for as journalists would be, in identifying a story idea, because often once we have done this bit of work, then it comes to, okay, all right, what's my story? What do I want to pitch? So certainly, I think we have laid the theme of a country and an organization, but we need to go from there. It could be an individual, maybe profiling an individual, like as Michael said, because often through an individual, if it's especially like a magazine like Caravan, we do a lot of long form. An individual stories is not just the individual story; it's a story of the organization, how he decide to go in a violent way, and then if it's about bomb blasts or planting something or doing a few things, of course, an individual allows you to tell a larger story. It can be a pattern that you observe, that certain thing has happened in this year, and this is how it's coming together, and this is how it's advancing. We often see these patterns in targeted violence, like, anti-Muslim or, attack on Christians and so forth in a country like India. We also see lower caste people who, in a caste-ridden society like India, how people who have historically been marginalized sometimes get attacked and so forth. And then, of course, from there, we once we identify the story, we get to devising a reporting plan and so forth. The challenges often is they're very, very secretive. They're like secret society in many sense. Some organization could be very legit. They have offices, but the ideological parent, especially the holding company, it's very difficult to sort of go see what's going on in the green room. And as investigative journalists, we know that what's on the stage is very little, and what's happening in the green room is what actually will have sort of a powerful side in terms of the journalistic work, that the output that we will produce. Then I think, of course, certainly digging, which is what investigative journalists do all the time. Most of the time, once we have identified the story, we certainly have to cultivate sources, and that's something for life. I mean, if you're covering far right, certainly it's a beat which, by now it's very certain that it's going to be here for most of the world. And maybe it's been a beat in a country like India for a long time, but if not, I'm sitting in India covering far right and publishing stories and investigations on far right. I'm in some sense, how much soever unfortunate the January 6th event was, but I think it has certainly brought it into the public attention that how far right can come together, how crazy it can become, and the Indians who took part in the January 6th protest, for example, there's clearly an affiliation to the far right in India, and so that is very, very evident there. There are pictures of them with the Indian Hindu nationalist leaders and so forth. So that's very evident that they go global and they have affiliations, they have ideological affiliations, they have in some cases financial affiliations, and so forth. And if there is something that we can learn from last century, that's something that needs to be exposed and nipped as early as one could, because Mussolini, making friends with Hitler, or Japanese and so forth, and at that point in time, where things which caused massive losses of lives and so forth, and the tragedy that we got it, I think. So if there is anything that in 21st century that we can learn from the 20th century, how the far right became the far right that it became, we certainly need to not just limit their connections to it as a local story. And as Michael has been sort of covering multiple regions and across the borders, this story certainly is a global story in that case. It brings me to the final point, which is, of course, the safety of the reporter. Often it's probably one of the most difficult beats to cover in that sense. I lost an editor friend of mine 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and then within Caravan there was a woman journalist, a woman colleague. She was sexually harassed while reporting, and two of my male colleagues were attacked while reporting by the same mob. Now, of course, certainly the phone, the electronic gadget that we use often, there are safety issues. That's probably common for other stories as well. But here, especially when the far right is in power, they are multiplying the forces. They have the state machinery, like the intelligence and the surveillance mechanism that the state can bring in. And we had seen this with a story that the Caravan had broke last year, and also Washington Post just a few weeks ago on Indian police planting malware in the computer of a human rights activist, and and planting so-called evidences, and then basically incarcerating them for a long time. And in a cleaning up exercise in Caravan, we had seen malware, we had spotted malware in our office systems and so forth. So there are threats of that nature. Legal intimidation, for example, is another. It could come not necessarily from far right all the time, but they will wait an opportunity to drag you to court and make your life difficult. And certainly, of course, if you have all the precautions taken in terms of the accuracy of the story and the legal vetting and so forth, there is nothing that one should be worried about. But certainly that's something that they will try to impose on you. Just last month they had put 10 sedition cases against somebody like me in 5 different Indian states. And of course, sedition law is something that the British had in India for a different purpose before India became independent. Now, the far right is using sedition laws to stop journalists like us in terms of just, if there is free coverage, if there is independent journalism, then that's something that they certainly can't stand. So the safety for a reporter and for the news organization is something that I think certainly needs some attention as we go. Yeah, that's pretty much what I have in case at the end, maybe if there are questions, we can come back to it. Yeah.
Thank you, Vinod. One of the things that's so interesting about GIJN is that a lot of the people on this webinar, a lot of the people who will watch this are reporting from countries that really don't have the legal, the rule of law protections that people like Michael and myself and GIJN have. And that's one of the things that really hit home when I was at the conference in 2019, talking to journalists from various different countries who came to me with extraordinary stories and said, look, I mean, I could investigate this, but the reality is that my family will be threatened and that this will happen and that will happen. Do you have advice for me? And my only advice was to say, look, I really am not in the position to advise you on that, because I'm coming from a position of absolute privilege, where I'm lucky enough to be in a country where, you know, journalists on the whole, they might get threatened, but they don't tend to have violence against them. So, you know, my absolute admiration and respect goes out to you, Vinod, and to all the other journalists on this forum who are doing work in those extraordinary circumstances. It really, you noted at the end of your presentation that this is among the most difficult investigative journalism to do. It's exponentially more difficult if you don't have the legal protections that some of us have. So, you know, huge admiration and appreciation. Well, let's move on now to GIJN from BuzzFeed, really doing some excellent work in recent years. I greatly enjoy reading your stories, GIJN, and very interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much for having me. So my co-panelists have touched on disinformation and sort of online propaganda campaigns that can really be key to the far right. So that's the perspective from which I'm coming to this conversation. And what I wanted to do was really give you some concrete tools and some concrete tips on how to investigate that propaganda, that disinformation, which of course spans borders and is one of the best recruitment weapons that these organizations have. If you want the slides with all the tools, you can find them here, and I believe you'll find the link in the chat as well. So the reason why it's important to investigate disinformation is because it's used to radicalize and recruit across the globe. It's really a problem on the left and the right, but the right have weaponized it in such a huge, comprehensive way that we can't help but pay attention to it. I've been on this beat since 2016, and I started out really, and still am, a disinformation reporter. But the extent to which disinformation has been weaponized sort of over time turned me into an extremism reporter just by virtue of what was happening with the information environment online. And the spaces where the far-right disinformation spreads are often also places where planning takes place or recruitment takes place. These are often private or semi-private spaces like Facebook groups and Telegram groups, and I'll give you some great tools to try to find some of those, which is why it's so important to pay attention to those and to include monitoring in the day-to-day activity that you do as you report things out. So as many of my co-panelists mentioned, we can use the online investigative techniques to sort of monitor for these groups and to understand ahead of time what is happening to them so that when the time comes, we can report these things out. But the last point I want to mention is beware of amplification. We as reporters have the power to bring messages to audiences that have not been previously exposed to those messages. So we need to take that power very seriously. There's no sort of perfect thought process that will tell you when to publish a story about a piece of disinformation or a story about a far-right group, but you can think through things like the potential for harm, how many people it's reached, whether that voice has been amplified by politicians or influencers or people with power. So as a reporter, you really want to be careful with your own power to expose audiences to some of this really horrible propaganda that these groups spread. And generally, the reason why we look at disinformation as a part of far-right groups is because of information laundering. Essentially, something will pop up on the internet, like with these examples from November 3rd, which was election day in the US, and will then be used in campaigns by politicians or as excuses for further action. So On the left is an election day claim that spread very, very widely afterwards that wasn't true in the first place, which was essentially people claiming that because ballot counters stopped counting ballots overnight in some places, that meant something nefarious was happening. And on the right, you'll see a tweet that shows a poll worker allegedly being prevented from entering a polling place when in the end it was just a misunderstanding. He was allowed to enter a polling place. So both of these narratives it really took on a life of its own and were really used as justification for sometimes violent action. And many of those narratives were echoed by the people who ended up at the insurrection on January 6th, just 2 or 3 months later. Which really shows the power of how quickly propaganda can radicalize and call to action sort of people who maybe were susceptible to the message, but didn't really weren't exposed to this message previously. So in terms of some of the tools that we use, again, you have that link at the top there. We honestly use anything and everything that is available to us. We use tools that are created for security researchers. We use tools that are created for marketers. And of course, we use tools that are created for reporters. And the reason why it's important to use these tools is because that allows you to map out not just debunk one piece of false information, but also map out where that piece of information was spreading, where it may have originated, who may be behind it, and what else that group could be doing. So combining all of these tools together really makes for a very powerful toolkit. But tools are one thing, but they go up and they go down. As we all know, social media companies specifically often tweak what we are or aren't able to search for. So I wanted to show you my favorite tool, which is a Boolean search. Many of you will be familiar with this. For others, that might be something new. And essentially, it's using search operators within search engines, for example, Google, to narrow down and really zero in on the type of information that you could be finding. So you could search government websites for annual reports. You could search Facebook for groups, which is kind of difficult to do on Facebook proper, the platform. You can search for contact information of somebody you're investigating. But the one that I really wanted to show you guys is the one on the bottom right, the site t.me / asterisk, which is the wildcard search operator. That's a great way to search Telegram, which is where the large chunk of far-right activity is located. So if you type that search into Google right now, you will get a lot of Telegram channels that are associated with Azov, which Michael mentioned earlier, which is one of the far-right movements in Ukraine. And these are channels that you wouldn't be able to find through other websites or other tools. So a lot of the time using these types of tools, you'll be able to see, for example, channels that are used for recruitment or vetting candidates. If you use this technique to search for the 3%ers, another far-right group in the US, you'll get some really interesting channels and you'll get some really interesting insight into how they vet new members and where those members go from there. And I do want to warn you to be careful. Don't join those channels unless you're sure that it is safe for you. You are usually able to view these channels without joining them on Telegram. And on the bottom there are some resources that I think I actually learned from another GIJN webinar that can really show you sort of the power of Boolean search, which is the one tool that you can almost always rely on. Also wanted to give you some tools on how to find deleted content. The Go Back in Time Chrome extension and the Wayback Machine extension are my all-time favorites because they allow you to, with 2 clicks, look for removed content. A lot of the people who we investigate in the US remove content post factum. We saw this again with January 6th and the insurrection. But having these tools in your back pocket allows you to find anything that's been archived that you might be able to use to expand your investigation and to better understand the groups that you're searching for. And I really want to stress, be able to use these tools in a pinch, practice them as much as you can during non-breaking news situations, integrate them into your workflow every day or every week. Maybe see if you can try out a new tool or a new search or a new way to discover information, because then when a breaking news story happens, you know exactly what to do and you know exactly how to search for. And I wanted to give you an example of this story because these are the tools that allowed me and my colleague Molly to very quickly zero in on threatening messages that we saw prior to the January 6th insurrection and write a story on the same day about the way that this insurrection was planned. So again, practicing these tools and using them day to day, incredibly important. I know we've already talked a little bit about security, but I wanted to show you 3 of the best tools for security. One is Tweet Eraser. It allows you to delete your past tweets. This is very handy if you, like me, have been on Twitter since 2009 and have no idea what the heck you were talking about back then. Tweet Eraser is a fantastic way to get rid of those tweets. I will say there's, essentially the way it works is you download your Twitter archive and then upload it to Twitter Eraser so that it's able to get past the limitations of the Twitter API. That archive stays on your computer. Twitter Eraser does not keep that archive, so your data is safe. So if anybody was worried about that, don't be. And then the other tools are Security Planner, which really helps you lock down all of your social media accounts and any other digital tools that you use. And Delete Me, joindeleteme.com, especially for US-based reporters, it's a great way to remove unwanted data from web services. So that means that you're essentially shrinking the target that people in these far-right groups can aim at when they are trying to harass you online. For some additional tools, the Verification Handbook is a free resource that's available across many different languages, Italian, Arabic, Turkish, English as well. A lot of the tools that I went through are mentioned in depth there with case studies. Highly recommend you look at that. OSINT Curious is a website that frequently publishes tutorials on how to conduct online investigations, new ways for tackling the same problems. That's a website that I check in almost every week regularly. And I also wanted to show the Media Manipulation Casebook, because this is a really great academic journal that dives into the way that information is manipulated, including by far-right actors. So if you want to understand the way the information environment is susceptible to manipulation from far-right actors and others, that is a great resource for you to start with. So that's what I've got. Happy to take any questions on anything else on anything else I haven't mentioned, or walk you guys through any of the tools that I've talked about.
Thank you, Jane. Lots of really good practical stuff there. I mean, I know that there's a link to it, but I was just like screenshotting as I went along to go and do some homework afterwards. So really appreciate it. I'm going to introduce GIJN's Hannah Coogans now, who's going to help us moderate the questions. She's going to sift through and then post them to us. So Hannah, if you want to take it away. I know we've been getting a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and let's have a good discussion for the last kind of 15 minutes or so.
Sure. Hi, and I just want to say a big thank you to all the panelists. You offered some amazing tools, but I'm going to start off with a question for Michael. Could you mention any additional lesser known open source tools or databases that you found to be helpful in digging into the far right or in general?
To be honest, for the work that I do, I do primarily use just the tools that I've mentioned, which well, not the tools, but the sites that I mentioned, Telegram in particular, Facebook these days less so, but also especially Instagram, in terms of trying to get a sense of what individual members or adherents within a movement might think. One thing that's key for me when I'm researching any far right movement, whether it's open source or whatever, is to try to pierce through the distinction between what's called, I guess, the front stage, you know, the way that a far right group wants to present itself to the public, versus the backstage, what they don't want public at all, or don't want to be publicized as much. And Instagram, I find, is more than people realize, is a good, once you kind of get a sense of individual adherents or members of a movement, like followers of certain accounts, people who comment on certain accounts, and it can be sometimes very clear from those profiles what some of these individuals feel or think about certain issues, or the way that they even relate to their movement. But in terms of other specific tools, I think GIJN just really walked us through the best tools. What I've talked about is much more general, and it's been very useful for me, and I've used some of the tools that GIJN's mentioned. But as far as like lesser known sources, I've really, everything that I've said and the things that GIJN has walked us through, that's primarily what I use.
Hannah, I just to take that for a second, I think my colleagues here would agree. A lot of these people are not very sophisticated, and they're not very smart. And in many cases, the amount of stuff that they're willing to say in public is quite extraordinary. So never underestimate the fact that that people will say extraordinary and dangerous things in public. Just go looking for it, and seek and ye shall find.
Great. Yeah, I think that's right. In any investigation that I've done into the far right, I'd say that I'd agree. One more little one for Michael. So one participant wishes to know, Michael, if you could say anything about who's funding Robert Rundo.
That's a good question. And this is something that I think all of us as journalists who cover the far right, it's a question we need to dig more deeply into, is who funds some of these groups or individuals. And I'll just flat out admit and say, I think it's been a shortcoming of some of the work that I've done, is that I haven't got into those issues as much. And saying that, it's also sometimes really difficult to parse who's funding a movement or an individual. And in the case of Mr. Rundo, it's really hard to say. On the one hand, a lot of the stuff that he has done or is doing in Europe is not stuff that requires a lot of money. There's things that might require a few $1,000s here or there. I know that before he went to Europe, he was actually working for one of his friends in California, so making money that way. But one speculation is that he has connections with another more prominent far-right figure who's based in Ukraine, a Russian neo-Nazi, Denis Kapustin. And there's not really any hard evidence of this, I'll stress, but Mr. Kapustin has been alleged to have some links to organized crime. And so potentially there might be an avenue there for some funding of Mr. Rundo. But generally with him as an individual, Mr. Rundo, I don't think what he does requires much funding beyond what he might be able to make from old jobs saved up or sales from his fashion line or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I might just pass over to Vinod and see if he has any comments on the issue of investigating funding. Vinod, do you want to say something?
That's certainly one of the big stories. I think we must pay a lot more attention than what we have done. Of course, we have looked at certain individuals, we have looked at some organizations minimally, but a lot more can be and should be done. And as I said earlier, I think this is a new beat or specialization in that sense, because I think world is just realizing how powerful they actually are. And I think going forward, I can see a lot more work will come out, and there are tons of stories that we can do using different kinds of tools, and so that's certainly a big area of specialization within covering the far right. In the past, there are some stories that has come out of how the Hindu far right groups in the United States, for example, has been sending money back home, which has been used in purchasing weapons, in killing religious minorities, and so forth. But I think these other there are things that has to have consistent investigation. Since then, I think that's sort of a virgin area, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that what you talk about using tools is, and this being a new beat, that's really interesting. Jane, you gave us a lot of really, really useful tools. So I was wondering, do far right groups have characteristics or strategies that present special data access challenges and opportunities for investigative reporters?
Honestly, like Will mentioned, it's quite easy to investigate the far right online because they're actually not very sophisticated actors. You can use some of the searches that I gave you to find Telegram channels that they consider hidden that are not, to look through parts of their websites that, again, they consider hidden but are not. Sort of the one difficulty is very frequently they'll have private chats on platforms like Rocket Chat or Discord, although not as popular anymore. And that is the case where if you wanted to report on what is happening in those private chats, you either have to misrepresent your identity, which will vary on how able you are to do based on your own internal policies and your own internal calculations, or sort of wait until somebody approaches you who's been in those channels who can leak you the internal information, which in the US is fairly frequent at this point, but I'm not sure about globally. But generally, one of the things about January 6th, which I think was so shocking to the world and to journalists in particular, is how willing people were to use their real names and to post about what they're saying and how available that information is online, which has led to a lot of really incredible investigative reporting. So there's often the sense that you need some specialized tools or some specialized skill sets to report on this stuff, but generally the more accessible investigations tools that I've shown you, they will do the trick. You don't need to get too fancy about it.
I'll just note as well that if you're in the 99.9% of journalists that don't work for BuzzFeed, then you watch with absolute envy as they get leaked the chats and the background information. Rightly so, because the people who are leaking that stuff know that people like Jane are doing fantastic work and understand it and know how to pass it. So, but it's certainly a source of envy for many of us.
So off the back of that, Will, if aside from doing your own personal investigations, are there any watchdog groups who monitor the international ties among these groups, and what are their best sources, and do they really have to reinvent the wheel every time they investigate a new group or start a new story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, Heidi Berwick, who used to be at the Southern Poverty Law Center, is actually in the process of, she just founded an organization. I was frantically Googling the name of it, but she just started a new organization that's going to focus on primarily on the connections between hate groups internationally. It's called the International Network for Hate Studies, and I'm keeping a very close eye on that. Heidi has I think worked for at least 2 or 3 decades at the SPLC, doing some incredible work tracking and backgrounding hate groups in the United States. She left the SPLC a couple of years ago to go focus on this international angle. So that's going to be a group to watch. I mean, other than that, the American-based groups do some work. I mean, I think, frankly, that the people who are on the cutting edge of understanding those relationships are on this webinar and are working for news organizations. I'm not aware of any sort of academic institution or other group that's tracking them. And maybe Jane, Michael, or Vinod has some other suggestions.
I think what I'll add from my perspective of somebody who focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, so it's more than two dozen countries. Part of the reason why I got into this beat or fell into this beat is because I realized that there really was not a lot of knowledge or information about the far right in this part of the world shared, not just in the English language sphere, but there's not a lot of information or knowledge about the far right and the interconnections of the far right within and between these countries. Like, for example, there's not, in a country like Bulgaria, for example, there is not a lot of discussion about the far right in that country and its connections with, say, the German far right. That discussion, I was one of the first people who started writing about some of the circumstances of the Bulgarian far right in English, and I found that odd, as I'm not any kind of Bulgarian speaker, or same with some of these other countries in the region. That's part of the reason why I've been motivated to write about some of these issues, and also to push Bellingcat as a platform, which you'll see more from us in the future, in terms of not just writing about this part of the world in Central and Eastern Europe as an outsider like me, but actively collaborating with journalists, with investigators and researchers in these countries to produce investigations, not just in English, but also in the local languages. It's very clear, it became very clear to me a few years ago, even from an academic perspective, that there is not a lot of shared information or knowledge about the far right in these countries and their interconnections. And I think the people on this webinar and the handful of other researchers and people out there are actively trying to change that. So
that leads me on really nicely to my last question, which is, do you have suggestions on where and how there can be that collaboration across borders to work on kind of figuring out these connections between groups and how the money is moving across borders? And I'll start with Vinod maybe, and everybody is welcome to answer this question.
I think there are three things which transcends a country's border with far right. One is disinformation campaigns, organized ones. Second is resources, financial resources. Third is sharing a political dream. Now, all three are very dangerous, especially sharing the political dream is something certainly that one should be worried about. And then the way that they go about doing it is disinformation mechanisms, and then the resources sharing, financial resources and human resources and so forth. So I think all these areas, it certainly there are many, these are larger themes in that sense. We can find story ideas, we can see people's movements and collaborations and working together, who has met whom, and then what kind of behind the scene office engagements did they have, each of these organizations and so forth. So there is, I can see a lot more work, journalistically speaking, coming in the next 10, 15 years, like even the international hate studies and monitoring, these are all, I think, in some sense, they're just starting to work. But also the challenges will also be more, because in a country like India, I can certainly see that there were probably at least 5 or 6 very significant far-right watching groups or lawyers and activists who were there 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but they're all being shut down, forced to shut down, or being jailed, or not simply not in operation, many of them. So that way, what they do also is that the internal research, which used to happen from outside journalism entities like lawyers and social groups and so forth, is coming down. Academic funding for one exactly is also sort of being monitored academic interactions have been curtailed. So they spend tentacles in ways that probably makes our job as journalists very difficult. But I think these are ways that they work, and one should probably see patterns and see probably, you know, how they spread it, and then study them closely.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, it seems like we should be having a panel like this every week, right? To you know, to connect and to discuss these issues. I mean, I think as a US-based journalist, one of the challenges is to convince editors that a story with an international nexus, a story about, for example, the far right in India or the far right in Brazil, where I used to live and report, you know, that's a story that will resonate with US audiences. And I think, frankly, you know, oftentimes those stories don't really resonate in US audiences because people are so focused on what's happening in the United States, at least over the last kind of 4 years. So that's really one of the challenges. We all know, all the people on this webinar know how important these international connections are, but convincing our readers or our watchers that that this is a really big problem that needs to be paid attention to, I think it should be foremost on all of our minds on how we do that. And this panel is a good start to that. And with Hannah's permission, I'm gonna wrap up because I know we're a little over time. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. But before I close, I'd like to thank GIJN and our audience today, and a very big thank you to our speakers, Michael, Vinod, and Jane, and for all those wonderful tips. Please remember to check GIJN.org for more tips, tools, and resources. And please join us for our next webinar, which is the same time on Thursday, the 4th of March, which is called Exporting Intolerance: How the Christian Right is Funding Political Causes Overseas. Once again, thank you all, and goodbye.